I'm going to be sharing 3 parts in Žižek's The Plague of Fantasies. It's the idea of saturation, which is the idea of like too much content and yet feeling empty. His work is not something that supports my argument directly in retaining the integrity of what it is that I felt that he is saying. I thought that I would make each part into 2 mini parts. The video is going to be broken down roughly into 3 different parts. The first is interpassivity. So I called this the intrusion into our interior world. I'll go through the end of passive consumption. The second is new media, dialogic relationship, democratic potential. The third is active observer or audience design spectacle. And the comment that I wrote was shared or neglected subjectivity due to constant activity. The second part is fantasy, so the inaccessibility or the problematic of the phenomenal self-experience. How fantasy is objectively subjective, what is the phenomenal self-experience, and how is it becoming more and more inaccessible. So my comment for this section is lost subjectivity, unconscious, something that we used to have no control over, is overridden by the exterior experience. So you can see here I tried to build an argument by trying to find a commonality between subjectivity. But then we get to the third part, which is empty, with a phantasmic inner life. And here I will talk a bit about mindless frenetic energy, so-called threat of new media, and an empty subject, which is the real threat. I think it's an important thing for me to ask, especially since now at like almost like 2,500 subscribers, which Jesse and Jeremy knows how much I think about the social impact that I have. And obviously I want it to be more positive than negative. But I also think about how it is that that impacts me, because I don't want to just make content that trends. And therefore, for me to try to get views, I create content on certain philosophers. I try to make points that I think people will click on. I'm doing YouTube so that I'm able to sustain my way of living while I study full time. But that being said, I don't want something that sustains what I actually love doing, which is reading and writing, to actually guide or influence too much my choices and my path, which is inevitable because we live in society. All the questions that comes with new media, the person who creates and the person who, I guess, consumes, which is all of us. I will actually be putting the book aside. I'll look at my notes, which I won't follow completely. But yeah, let's start with interpassivity. Interpassivity, the intrusion into our interior world, fetishism and its vicissitudes. So I will start the quote, which is, "It is commonplace to emphasize how with the new electronic media, the passive consumption of a text or a work of art is over. I no longer merely stare at the screen, I increasingly interact with it, entering into a dialogic relationship with it, from choosing the programs through participating in debates in a virtual community to directly determining the outcome of the plot in the so-called interactive narratives. Those who praise the democratic potential of the new media generally focus on precisely these features, on how cyberspace opens up the possibility for the large majority of people to break out of their role of passive observer, following the staged spectacle by others, and to participate actively, not only in the spectacle itself, but more and more in establishing the very rules of the spectacle." So comments, like, subscribe, share. And I said this to Jesse and Jeremy over the call. I was just like, y'all realize that I don't ask you to like, share, and subscribe anymore? Because one, it's pathetic. I have never liked, shared, or subscribed when a person has asked me to. I do it when I really like the content and I go like, this is the least I can do when I like the content to like. Also, if you read Wittgenstein's The Lectures on Aesthetics, one thing that he says that I completely agree with is that when we like something, we want to maintain in relation with it. So if you guys like my videos or what I'm saying, you will naturally subscribe because you would like to remain in contact. So I've written a few comments. When we're active, we are not in ourselves. Our focus is on the exterior world. And this is basically just saying that if we're always engaged, there's no time for reflection, simply. And the second thing, again, Wittgenstein, he's my boy. Wittgenstein says that when we read, we exclude our thoughts to be guided by the symbolism in front of us. 2 things about that. One, the book Philosophical Investigations, super interesting. super interesting, and this is where I got the quote from. The second is that when I was in Italy and I was at the Vatican Museum and the Sixtine Chapel. Is it a museum? No, but then it's treated like a museum for tourism. The guide talked about the power of images. She said that back then people didn't read, so artists thought a lot about how to communicate what it is that the Bible said without them being able to write the text because they couldn't read. So there was this really interesting thing about angels. She said that Michelangelo was very faithful to the Bible, so all of his angels do not have wings. The only reason why other artists, and the only reason why we now associate angels with wings, is because back then these artists, unlike Michelangelo, wanted to convey flight, wanted to convey, between worlds, wanted to convey that they're above human with wings. It's the idea that even though the original text does not have wings, we've associated angels with wings because that's how it's been constantly represented to us. And we're going to see in the second part where there is this kind of dissonance between how we objectively see things and how it is that because they're constantly represented to us in a certain way that we are denied in some way how it is that we even perceive the so-called objective reality. The very broad analogy that I'm trying to make here is that even though originally, objectively, in the Bible, there are no wings, because we've constantly seen angels with wings, we have changed our perception or our understanding of what is the image and the form of an angel because of us constantly receiving these new representations. Bref, even if I tell you that angels originally do not have wings based on the Bible, you're not going to be able to disassociate angels with wings. The other note that I wrote was active observer, democratic potential, and who defines the role of the spectacle that are my videos. And I said this to Jessie, I was just like, yeah, I know what I made. I like my content, but let's be honest. Most of the value, or if not all of the social value of my content is based on how many views it has, how many likes it has. This is what I mean when I said that I do not want my YouTube or my videos to influence how it is that, one, I value my work, and two, I don't want it to skew my interests. So then the question becomes, why is it that I have so many voting polls on my community tab? My strategy for that is only to offer things that I'm interested in or I feel that will further help me develop what it is that I'm trying to understand. Also, I guess I'll just add this here, which I might delete later because people will be like, oh my god, the fact that she doesn't care. It's not that. I don't know how you guys feel about algorithms, but I feel like they make us super lazy. Like when you see comments of people being like, oh yeah, it only took the algorithm 7 days to recommend me your video. It's like, if you don't go, well, even you don't even have to go out in the world. You just have to search on YouTube. But even so, algorithm does block us in a certain way where you search something, but based on your previous searches, they don't actually show you what you want to see. But the fact that you don't even have to go out into the real world and you still can't be bothered to just search, you're not going to find anything interesting if you don't look. They're making predictions on your past. They're not going to serve you anything that is going to open you up to the future. And to say that you're going to rely on the algorithm to serve you up something interesting is just delusional. So what I'm hoping with my channel is, even though sometimes I feel like, oh, I don't know who this is going to resonate with, if I think that it has a purpose and I think it's interesting and I care about it, maybe it might open up the minds of people who never thought that they could care about it. I feel like this is going to be a long video, but I'm done with this section and we're going to move on to the objectively subjective or fantasy. Okay, I lied. So I wasn't done. I realized this is one part that I didn't talk about. Active observer. So usually when you go to a play and you go to a film, you're a passive observer. You are watching the spectacle and you are just seeing what a person has to offer. When you are relieved of this need for activity, the need to like, subscribe, comment, you are able to free up this part of your brain that doesn't go okay, at what point am I going to choose to have a reaction? And that's the thing that he says is the selling point of this democratic aspect. And the really cool thing is that I didn't think of this until I'm actually doing this right now. That is something that I would believe that contributes to the reason why we feel oversaturated. Not only are we constantly receiving all this information from social media, new media, but it is the clash of receiving all this information while we have all of our own thoughts that come into play when we realize that we are supposed to have an active participation, to be an active observer of new media, of social media. Now I'm actually done with the first part. So the second part, the objectively subjective or fantasy. Fantasy, the objectively subjective. This is in page 155. It's a pretty long quote, so let's get started. The ontological paradox, scandal even, of these phenomena, whose psychoanalytic name, of course, is fantasy, lies in the fact that they subvert the standard opposition of subjective and objective. Of course, fantasy is by definition not objective, in the naive sense of existing independently of the subject's perception. However, it is not subjective either, in the sense of being reducible to the subject's consciously experienced intuitions. Fantasy rather belongs to the bizarre category of the objectively subjective, the way things actually objectively seem to you, even if they don't seem that way to you. So I skip a little bit to page 157 and I continue with, therein lies the dialectical synthesis between the realm of the objective and the realm of the subjective, not simply in the notion of subjective appearance as the mediated expression of objective reality, but the notion of the semblance which objectivizes itself and starts to function as a real semblance. The semblance sustained by the big other, the symbolic institution, against the mere subjective semblance of actual individuals. So I skip a little bit and go to, according to the standard view, the dimension which is constitutive of subjectivity is that of the phenomenal self-experience. I am a subject the moment I can say to myself, no matter what unknown mechanism governs my acts, perceptions, and thoughts, nobody can take away from me what I see and feel now. Lacan turns this, and this is where I get stuck because I have no background on Lacan, standard view around. The subject of the signifier emerges only when a key aspect of the subject's phenomenal self-experience, his fundamental fantasy, becomes inaccessible to him. That is to say, is primordially repressed. At its most radical, the unconscious is the inaccessible phenomenon, not the objective mechanism which regulates my phenomenal experience. And here is why this isn't in black and white. I have a very superficial understanding on the unconscious because I did do a bit of reading on it, but I haven't read any of Freud's work in its entirety. I just don't want to lead you astray. But let me just talk about what I find interesting in this passage. Obviously, the first point is saying objectively subjective. Like, what was that? And it took me a couple of times to actually try to make sense of this sentence. The way things actually objectively seem to you, even if they don't seem that way to you. To go back to the word objectively subjective, why it is that fantasy is subjective, but with an objective quality. I feel like here is the dissonance between what it is that we actually see, the objective reality, what is outside of us, doesn't match up with the way we perceive it. And this little comment that I want to make here about not simply in the notion of subjective appearance as the mediated expression of objective reality, but the notion of a semblance which objectifies itself and starts to function as the real semblance. I guess here what we can take away from this is no longer that the world is presented to us through our subjective lens, but when the semblance, or I feel like it's ideology because he says the semblance sustained by the big other and the symbolic institution. Instead of ideology, let me use this word. The narrative that has been told to us by governments or by science or by any institution. This is the state of things because it is held up and constantly perpetuated. Objectifies is like it starts to have ontological value. It starts to become real and concrete in reality. So if you were to tie back social media to this conversation, I would say the real semblance is literally influencers. Is we go, oh, their numbers don't count. They're not real. They are numerical pixels, digits of whatever that seems to give them value. And yet, the way things have evolved is that those numbers represents people, it represents attention, and then it represents influence in terms of, because we see that one person has so many followers, so many people's attention, then we associate that person as having value. And because they have perceived value, that starts to create real value. There's this one guy that I follow, he's called Abroad in Japan. And I think I followed him like a long time ago, maybe, I don't know, like 10 years ago, when he was complaining about haters, which is really funny. To now, I think like the last thing I saw about him was that he was at Buckingham Palace. So before, this non-perceived value of people being like influencers don't really do anything, to them actually realizing this influence by being in the Buckingham Palace, because not everyone, I obviously think, gets invited to the Buckingham Palace, is this objectivization. So now we get back to the phenomenal self-experience, which he qualifies as, I am a subject the moment I can say to myself, no matter what unknown mechanism governs my acts, perceptions, and thoughts, nobody can take from me what I see and feel now. I think like what I find really interesting but also really difficult about this part of the text is that there are so many moving parts. There is the personal subjectivity, and also there's the realization of semblance, which is not concrete. So then the question becomes, what is real? And I think that's the whole point. The whole point is that the challenge between the subject's phenomenal experience, what I see and what I feel right now in terms of reality, in the face of reality, to the fact that even that feeling, that subjective quality that is personally mine, is taken away as objective reality begins to encroach itself onto my subjective experience of reality. To say this differently, before the question was whether I distort life through my subjective lens. But then now it is more so that, do I lose my subjective lens or my personal lens on reality because the exterior world is taking over how it is that I myself am, I don't know if you want to say allowed to experience reality. I feel like the issue, there's many issues. I feel like the issue is that I've thought of fantasy as a kind of perversion, a kind of like wanting the world to be the way we want it to be. But if this is the case, and if we're denied our own fantasy, we're denied our own personal interpretation of the world. We're denied the dissonance between how we feel about the world and how the world presents itself. And that's like super important, because if we don't have this dissonance, the world will never change. Because you will never see the world anything other than objectively. That is like really interesting, because you would say that the most intelligent thing to do is to be able to see the world objectively. And yet, if the objective reality is the continual objectivization of appearances, of the way that people in power want the world to seem in a certain way, and that again can go from like the government to even influencers, and we can't maintain this dissonance that we go like, okay, I know it objectively seems that way to me, but then I myself do not feel that this is the way things are. We will have no capacity for dissent. But that's the problem with positive science, the insufficiency of positive science, and the insufficiency, in my opinion, of facts. Because if you have a phenomenological perspective, and I guess it's metaphysical, behind them there are a lot of things that happen to bring about a certain manifestation, but the interpretation of the certain manifestation needs to be put into question. If we were to take reality simply as objective, simply as the way the exterior reality appears to us, then I'm gonna be super Žižek, but then we are lost. But then we are. We are lost because we will be forever chained to what it is that actually concretely exists, of what simply exists unquestionably. This is something that I attacked in my finals paper called A Violent Philosophy, about being able to put things to question. When you write something, you create a distance between you and the world, a distance between actually living in a concrete, tangible reality so that you can critique it. But this goes to a more fundamental level of, even if you write something, but you don't have your subjectivity or you don't have access to fantasy, that you wouldn't even know how to distance yourself, even if you use the mechanisms of writing. I am not going to make a comment on the parts on Lacan. One, because it's going to take forever, and two, I think I need to be a lot clearer on Lacan, Freud, consciousness, and maybe even Kant to make this analysis. So we're gonna move on to the third one, which hopefully is a bit easier, but not really, because this is fun. Empty with a phantasmic inner life. Oh no. Does this go against everything that I just came up with? Okay, we'll see. So I'll see you in part 3. Part 3, empty with a phantasmic inner life, mindless frenetic energy, and an empty subject. So here he talks about the so-called threat of new media and the actual threat. So the quote is, in contrast to the commonplace according to which the new media turn us into passive consumers who just stare blindly at the screen, one should claim that the so-called threat of new media lies in fact that they deprive us of our passivity. So this is the idea of like, oh, zombie nation, we're just all scrolling on our phones, not thinking. But we're actually doing a lot of work when we're on social media with the, again, like, share, and subscribe. So to continue, of our authentic passive experience, and thus prepare us for the mindless frenetic energy. So we have a lot going on because, again, the confrontation between our actual thoughts and the images and texts and words and ideas that we're being bombarded with. In contrast to the notion that we are dealing with a subject, the moment an entity displays signs of a phantasmic inner life, which cannot be reduced to external behavior, one could claim that what characterizes subjectivity is rather the gap which separates the two. Fantasy at its most elementary is inaccessible to the subject, and it is this inaccessibility which makes the subject empty. Okay, I didn't contradict myself, this is great. We thus obtain a relationship which totally subverts the standard notion of the subject who directly experiences himself, his inner status, an impossible relationship between empty, non-phenomenal subject and the phenomena which forever remains desubjectivized, inaccessible to the subject, the very relationship registered by Lacan's formula of fantasy. This is kind of like a defense of fantasy. So let's start from what is a subject. A subject is not merely the sign of phantasmic inner life that cannot be reduced to external behavior. What is subjectivity? He says that subjectivity is not when a subject shows signs of phantasmic inner life, but that subjectivity is rather the gap which separates the two, the separation between subject and phantasmic inner life, which is fantasy. So then the question is, how does our subjectivity actually deprive us of this accessibility to our fantasy? It separates the subject from directly experiencing himself. Well, it's terrible with the mic, but when you have subject, and then you have subjectivity in between, which we can say is like the Kantian lens, and then you have fantasy. And in the middle with subjectivity, I wrote, our own inner life that denies our own projections on the world, given up or overridden by its constant participation, distraction in the exterior world, neglecting our own interior world, our unconscious, empty, locked out of our own interior world, imaginations, fundamental desires, fantasy, not understanding them through the preoccupation and the invasion from the exterior world. That was actually not bad. And with imagination and fundamental desires, I would just say that that includes our personal feeling and perceptions of the exterior world that might not actually coincide with the facts or the objective world. Our imagination, again, just what is not concretely real. And the last line I want to comment on, which I think is interesting, but if you have a different interpretation, leave a comment down below, which he says inner status, which is us directly experiencing ourselves, is an impossible relationship between empty, non-phenomenal subject and the phenomena which forever remains desubjectivized. Does that mean that emptiness arises when we no longer have a grip on reality? What the fuck? Wait a minute. If you have an interesting reading on this last line, and then he goes to say that this is an impossible relationship between empty, non-phenomenal subject and the phenomena which remains forever desubjectivized, inaccessible to the subject. Please feel free to share. But what I want to say is that it seems to me extremely clear that if we are not able to retain the dissonance between how we feel about reality and how reality is presented to us, and if all phenomena is no longer directly experienced in terms of we do not again, like, because we lose this dissonance of like my subjective experience of life, my direct experience of life does not hold up against how life is concretely, constantly presenting itself to me, that I am emptied of my own subjectivity. And therefore what? What does it mean if I'm emptied of my own subjectivity? You can easily say, like, then you don't have your own thought. But I feel that this has more interesting implications than that. It's gonna be a bit difficult to post this because, again, it's part of a process thing. But if you're not a hater and you actually have interesting contributions to help me on this subject, which I think is really interesting, please share. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.